Bueno, pues gracias por estar aquí nuevamente. Vamos a seguir si quieren. Gil, ¿nos ayudas a cerrar las puertas tal vez? Vamos a seguir con la segunda parte de este taller y pues bueno, ya saben, preguntas o comentarios breves que quieran hacer, por favor levanten la mano y los vamos incorporando a la presentación. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Okay, so I thought I would talk a little bit more about implicit biases and the research on implicit biases in judges. I spoke about this to some extent yesterday, but I'll add a few more. What we know about implicit biases about people as psychologists are really two things. One, that virtually everybody harbors a variety of invidious or discriminatory associations. So in the United States, most white adults, as I'll say a few times, more closely associate white faces and European people of European descent with good or positive imagery, and African Americans with negative or sometimes even violent imagery. Likewise, there are many implicit biases about gender, in which most adults in the United States, where I know the data a little better, more closely associate male names and men with career, and female names with family concepts. I say there are a number of tests for implicit associations. I personally have that male career, female family bias to a very strong extent. I've tested myself. It's important to be aware of your own biases. And much of the reason for why is how my wife and I have divided our lives. She chose to stay home with our kids. I chose to stay at work. And so your own life is really a cue to how you think about the world, of course. And so I have that association very, very strongly. We also know that these associations, I should add the word sometimes here, sometimes influence judgment. They don't always. And those instances in which we can avoid relying on implicit biases are interesting and important. But they do sometimes influence judgment. And in our research, we have shown they do sometimes influence judgment in judges as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about gender, because I haven't spoken much about biases on gender. What we know is most adults more easily associate men with careers and female with family. And does this influence judgment? Well, we wondered that in judges. And so we picked a topic that was likely to induce implicit biases in judges about gender. We chose family law as a topic. And this is actually a good example of a problem for us in which judges expressed a bias but kind of surprised us. Judges are very different research subjects than undergraduates or ordinary adults. They do sometimes do something very different than what you think they're going to do. So we gave these judges, we've actually done this study in the United States, Canada, and Switzerland. We're opportunists. You know, I said, why Switzerland? Because we knew someone who could collect data there with judges. We wrote a family law case concerning parental mobility. What I mean by that is, I'll have to tell the story a little bit. We told this story about a couple who had two young children and they had gotten divorced. And one of the parents is the custodial parent, meaning they are the primary caretaker. The children live with that parent. And the other parent has a lot of access to the children, but the children don't live with the other parent. The other parent works as a lawyer in a large law firm in a big city where they both live. The custodial parent had a career before staying home with children, and then received a job offer which would require that the custodial parent move to a distant city. And in fact, the distant city was a small town, very, very small town, in fact. And so the non-custodial parent really would have to entirely give up their career to try to restart it in this small town, and it was not practical. The non-custodial parent was working in a large law firm in an urban area, and this little town was not going to support the kind of work that the non-custodial parent was used to doing. So the non-custodial parent either has to give up their career or give up a lot of access to their children. Right? So they opposed doing that. And we wrote two versions of this. We wrote one in which the mother is the custodial parent, which in the United States accounts for about 95% of these situations. So it's the most common scenario by a lot. But it is also possible to have the opposite. So we wrote a version in which the father was the custodial parent. So that the father had given up his career and was staying home with the children, but wanted to restart his career. So the question for the judge was, will you allow this custodial parent, who is now just staying at home with the children, to move to a very distant city and start their career again with this new job opportunity with the children, or must the person remain in the city? It's again an area on which there's very little law, in the sense that the judge has to follow a set of rules. The only rule, basically, is the judge should really attend closely to the best interest of the children. It's one that's going to be important, as you'll see. But that's very vague. The custodial parent was arguing it was better for the children if they saw this parent having a career, and the children would then have more financial resources available. The non-custodial parent, of course, said the opposite, that this was breaking up their relationship, in a sense, and that they'd have to move. So the judge faces a very difficult choice. This comes up fairly often in family law among families with professional parents, where if they get divorced, they may want to move, and it's very difficult to know, for a judge to know what to do. So it was a good problem for us. All right, the question is, may the custodial parent move with the children? The children, I should say. For us, we made a prediction here. We thought that since most adults more easily associate males with career and female with family, that the judges would be more likely to allow the father to restart his career and go back to work than the mother. So they'd be more inclined to rule in favor of the father than they would when it was the mom described as the custodial parent. As I said, judges surprise us. So when the half of the judges who read the version in which the mother wanted to restart her career, 80% of the judges were willing to let her move to restart her career. This was not what we predicted, and seemed to us, initially at least, to be contrary to the implicit biases judges would have about women in careers. We thought the judges would make the mom stay at home, continue to stay at home with the kids, rather than restart her career. But it was the opposite. 80% of the judges thought that the mother should be allowed to move. The father, not so much. Less than half of the judges were willing to allow the father to move to restart his career. And this really puzzled us because it's the opposite of what we predicted. So we interviewed the judges afterwards and asked what they were thinking. And what the judges who had read the scenario in which the mother wanted to move basically said was they really had very few concerns that the mother would do anything other than fail that she would do a good job, in other words, of taking care of the children. That she would still be an excellent mom, even though she was now balancing career and home, that she'd figure that out. One judge said, if those kids are sick, she's going to stay home with them. I don't know how you know. It's only a hypothetical. That is implicit bias to the core. They know nothing about this person. It's a one-page fact pattern, but if she's sick, if the kids are sick, she'll stay home with them. The father, the judges express a great deal of concern with how the kids were going to be cared for, whether the dad would remain as an attentive parent while he was now trying to restart his career. And they were concerned that the children would get neglected by their father while he was trying to balance home and work. So what we realized, of course, was that this was about implicit bias, but it's an implicit bias that favored the mothers, at least in this context, because it meant that the judges thought of her as a good parent, even though she was trying to balance work and home, whereas they actually thought the father would not do a very good job of this. And of course, the law focuses their attention on the best interests of the children, right? So that the judges are trying to worry about how the children's lives are going to look, and they had fewer concerns about that when the mom was trying to be a career, to have a career and be a mom, than they did about the father. They felt that the children were going to be worse off if the father went back to work when he was the custodial parent. So it was kind of interesting. And then we've collected some more data, and this was true in the United States, in Canada, and in Switzerland, more or less to the same extent. Didn't seem to matter which country we were studying. One thing we know about the Canadian judges in particular, we also collected data on their implicit associations. And I'll explain a little bit about how we did that in a moment. But we collected data on how closely they associated male career and female family. Because some of the judges did not have that strong implicit bias, and some did. So people vary on that. And so we broke them up into people who had, I'm using some jargon here that I'll explain in a minute. I apologize for that. The slide's a little out of order. That we divided the judges into judges who harbor this strong association between male and career and female and family, and judges who are a little more neutral on that, the sort of low implicit bias and high implicit bias. The judges with low implicit bias, really, I mean, there's a little bit of favoritism for fathers in there, but not much. Those numbers really don't differ a lot. If you look at the variation, it sort of overwhelms that. Where we get our effect that favors mothers is really among the judges that have that strong implicit bias. So in other words, what we're able to show with this data is not just that the judges are favoring the mothers over the fathers. We're showing it is directly attributable to the implicit biases they harbor about males and careers and females and home. And in some of our other studies, we of course show that this bias works to the detriment of women. In this case, it gets the mother what she wants, but in many cases, it's very much the opposite. I'll just give that one. Now, when we study race and implicit bias, I said yesterday, judges are very much on guard about showing expressing racial bias. Strangely, in family law, judges seem to have very few qualms about expressing their implicit biases about what they think of the litigants when they're male versus female. That seems to be much more acceptable to them than race. In the United States, judges who say who would endorse racial biases would run into disciplinary problems, and so they're very much more guarded about the role that race plays in their decision making. And we've seen in many of our studies that judges don't actually treat African American, Latino, and white defendants differently when they're engaged in sentencing, and I elaborated on that yesterday. And so I'll give you one example of that. This is not sentencing, but it's closely related. We gave judges a fact pattern involving a defendant, and the question was whether to convict this defendant of battery, of physically harming another individual. The story was that the defendant was on a basketball team in his high school, and he got into a fight with a team member in the locker room, and he badly injured this victim. He pushed him into a block of lockers and hurt him and sent him to the emergency room. And we for half the judges, we said the defendant was white, and for the other half, we said the defendant was black, and the victim was always the opposite race. So when we had a white defendant who had perpetrated this act, it was always a black victim. When we had a black victim, when we had a black defendant, we always said he had assaulted or battered a white victim. So it was always a cross-race crime. We could have done 4 versions of this. We needed to simplify it a little, so it's always a cross-race crime. This study was done with lay adults in the Detroit airport. This is done by a researcher who somehow got through security and was giving out surveys for people waiting to fly planes. Psychologists are very clever about where they get their subjects from. Whenever, as a psychologist, you notice a lot of people sitting around doing nothing, you tend to think they could be filling out a survey. And so that there's some data from the Detroit airport on non-judge adults that suggests there is a bias among lay adults, that the conviction rate is higher when the defendant is described as black than when the defendant is described as white among lay adults. When we did this study with judges, we didn't see that at all. If anything, the conviction rate was a little bit higher for whites, but really that's not a significant difference. The conviction rate was really the same. And we've seen that over and over. When you explicitly identify the race, when you say this is a white defendant, this is a black defendant, and it's a criminal context, we don't see any differences. But in fact, when we're more careful, we can see that the judges are actually masking an implicit bias. And I'll show you that.
Jeffrey,
I'm sorry,
just one very quick thing. I'm not sure that everyone knows what the implicit association test is.
I'm about to explain that.
Ah, okay.
Excellent. So there are some other examples, but I do exactly want to explain what the implicit association test is. So on those judges that treated the black and white defendant the same, we don't really see the differences, but we also try to be more careful, to really closely measure the implicit biases of judges. And what we use is a device called the implicit association test. And that's how we measure unconscious bias. See, we're thinking alike. So the question is the very next. I love when a question can be answered by the next slide. It always feels like you really know what you're doing. We do measure the implicit bias of judges. I said that we did that on gender without explaining how, but I'll explain in some detail how we did that on race with this group of judges. It measures more or less the association people have between different categories. And it uses a fairly standard computer task. You can also do it with paper and pencil. It's a little clumsier. And I'll show you sort of what the computer task looks like. What we're trying to do is ask the question, how closely does someone associate white faces or white people with positive imagery? And how closely do people associate black faces with negative imagery, or the opposite? Right, so we're trying to measure that close association. If you were here yesterday, you might remember I asked, what your reaction to the word natural was. And most people have a very positive association. If you wanted to free associate what you think of when you think of natural, you'll get a lot of positive words. Whereas foreigner, you'll get a lot of negative words, particularly in the United States at the moment, unfortunately, that more people associate foreign with negative than positive. Here we're looking for associations or commonalities with black and with white. And the way you measure it is with this computer task. And the computer task looks like this. So if you're measuring implicit bias with the implicit association test, you get your research subject to look at a computer screen, and you tell the research subject that your job is to sort stimuli. And you're sorting them by category. And so we're going to show you one of 4 different kinds of stimuli. We're either going to show you a white face, a black or African American face, or we're going to show you a positive word or a negative word. And so if it's a white face or a positive or a good word, we press a key that's on the left-hand side of the keyboard, an E key, the E. So you keep your fingers on them and you put little dots on the keys. So they press a key on the left-hand side of the computer if it's a white face or a good word, and they press a key, the I key, which is on the right-hand side of the computer, if it's a black face or a bad word. And then what happens is the computer will show the person a face. And this is a white face. So what the research subject should do is press the E key. And what the computer is doing is measuring in milliseconds how long it takes the research subject to identify properly that face. So as soon as the face comes on, the computer starts timing. It doesn't tell the subject what it's doing, but the computer starts timing how long before they get the right answer, before they sort that as a white face, pressing a key on the left-hand side. If a black face comes up, they should press a key on the right-hand side, and again, it'll score how long it takes for them to respond correctly. And of course, if it's a good word, like happy or love, then they press the key, the same key that they would have for the white face. Or if it's a bad word, they press a key on the right-hand side, like awful, war, death, etc. If they make a mistake, the computer makes a noise, goes beep, and then a little X appears, and the research subject is just told to press the correct key. And what the computer does is it scores how long it takes to press the correct key. It also records the number of wrong answers, which is actually not really scored, but we're just looking at how long it takes to get this correct. Now, for most white adult Americans in the United States, this version of the task is a lot easier than this version. Now what's different? Listen, look, it's pretty subtle. But here, they're supposed to press a key on the left if it's a black face or a good word, as opposed to a white face or a bad word. And the reason it's harder for most white adults in the United States is that when it's white or good, they're kind of making a valence judgment, good or bad, right? And so the faces, because they're more closely associated with positive imagery anyway when they're white, they're really only making one judgment, positive or negative. And so that's pretty easy, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. They can go very fast. But now they have to make two judgments. Is it a black face? Is it a white face? Is it a good word? Is it a bad word? Those concepts aren't closely associated in most white adult Americans' minds, so they have to make two judgments. Which is it? A face, and then is it good or bad or white or black? Right? So that just takes longer. When the concepts are closely associated, like white or good and black or bad, people are faster. The same is true for male career, female family. You're kind of making one judgment. Is it a work thing or a home thing? Right? Male work, female home. That's, again, for people who harbor those close associations. For people who don't have these associations, who don't really closely associate white and good and black and bad, or who in some cases, African Americans in the United States have the opposite association, then in fact, the tasks are equally hard. So what this task really does very well is measures how close those concepts are associated in one's mind. And it does so by measuring how long it takes to answer the question. And in fact, when the associations like this for most adults in the U.S. are not consonant or not congruous, they don't associate black and good, the task is actually harder. They sweat a little more. They tell you it's harder if you ask them about it. And of course, it takes longer. And so that's how you measure the implicit association. It's a pretty good device because you don't ask people, are you racist? They won't tell you the answer to that. It just measures how closely these things are associated. And so then that gives one a sense of whether that invidious judgment is sort of embedded in that person's understanding of the world. It doesn't make them an evil or immoral person. I always tell my research subjects that it doesn't make you a racist because you have this association. For me, I don't think I'm a sexist because I have the close association between male and career and female and family. It's just most of my life experiences sort the world that way because of the choices my wife and I have made about how to live our lives. It produces that association in us. The associations involving race are often fed by popular culture, by what one sees on television, by stories one reads, by racist jokes that people tell, which white people do tell to each other in the United States all the time. I get them from my father all the time. I was like, Dad, please, we're trying not to do that. No, you just won't admit it's funny. No, it's not funny. We all have the crazy uncle. For me, it's my father. I like him very much, but he does have that bias. We know from our research on the implicit association test that 80% of white Americans favor that white good, black bad pairing. They find that version of the task easier than when it's black good and white bad. 4 out of 5 Americans, just white Americans, find that easier. The implicit association test then correlates with a number of decisions and judgments. So there's some pretty interesting studies. There's one really well-done study on cardiologists. Where the researchers measured the implicit associations of cardiologists and sorted them into those that had a strong white good, black bad association and those that had a very weak one or none at all, and then gave them 2 hypothetical cases to diagnose. And it turns out the cardiologists with the strong white good, black bad association actually diagnose their patients differently based on whether the patients are described as black or white, even though the symptoms are always the same. In particular, they give the diagnosis to a black patient that would require less follow-up. Right? I think that's kind of interesting. So if they have a black bad association, they're inclined towards a diagnosis that leads to less face-to-face encounters with that patient. Right. So whereas when it's a white patient, they diagnose them with something that requires that they see them in a week and then in a month and then over and over again. So it does suggest it does influence that. There are some interesting studies on employment decisions by human resource professionals in the United States, and there's a good one in Sweden where the bias is not white and black, but white and Arab. And there's a group of human resource professionals who make who we have records of their actual hiring and promotion decisions, and then can correlate them with their association. And the ones who have the strong white good association, Arab bad, are less likely to promote Arabs who live in Sweden and work for their company than those human resource professionals that don't have that association. So it does suggest it produces decisions. There's some neurological evidence as well that people in the United States who have a strong white good, black bad association, when they recognize, when they do recognition tasks for African American faces, in fact use different parts of their brain. They use the amygdala, which is a sort of fight or flight type of response, rather than more social parts of the brain. So there's some neurological relationship to this as well. We, of course, wonder about judges. We've done some very careful studies of implicit associations in judges and race. White judges, we had 3 different groups of white judges from different parts of the United States. Basically, on average, show a difference, that they are, in fact, more inclined to be faster on the white good, black bad characterization than the opposite. They're about 1/5 of a second faster. 1/5 of a second doesn't sound like much, but on the IAT, people move really, really quickly. The task is not difficult. 1/5 of a second is a big bias. That's a pretty big gap between the two. And actually, nearly 90% of our judges were faster on the white good, black bad pairing than the opposite pairing. We had a group of 43 African American judges in this sample as well. They slightly favored, I guess, the white good pairing if you look at the average, but it's 1/50th of a second, which is not really much of a difference. That is to say, they really didn't express a difference. And in fact, only only a little under half of them were faster on the white good, black bad pairing. More of the judges were faster on the black good, black bad pairing. Of course, so what we find on this when we're careful is the judges do in fact harbor the same kinds of implicit invidious biases that we see in ordinary adults. We see it on gender in our group of Canadian judges. We see it on race in American judges. And then the question becomes, what kind of situations would bring out this bias? When will we observe it? Because we know we don't see it on sentencing or in the criminal context. So when do we see it? I talked yesterday about a family court decision where we saw it. Here's one where we were a little more subtle. We gave judges a fact pattern involving a juvenile offender, and the way we suggested race, we actually stripped out all of the potential racial references in the problem. So the judges could not tell what race the person was. And then we added a few. We added a number of subtle suggestions that the defendant, in this case a juvenile, it's a 14-year-old, we added a number of suggestions that the person was white. We did that by identifying the neighborhood they were from and a couple other things, but we didn't say it outright and we didn't give their name. And then for half the judges, we primed them with words that most Americans would associate with African Americans. By priming, what we did is we had a computer task where we showed them a word and then covered it up very quickly with a random string of letters. So they really couldn't see what the word was. But it suggested a concept to them. And the words we primed half of the judges with were words that are associated with African Americans. Some of them are proper nouns, like the word Harlem is a place most Americans associate with African Americans. We had Oprah on there. She's African American. We had basketball, Jerry curl, which is a hairstyle, and segregation. Words like that collectively Americans would associate with African Americans. Or we had fairly neutral words that you don't really associate with anything. And then we also knew the implicit bias score of the judges. So what we then wanted to do is, if we're subtly suggesting race of the criminal defendant, and then we can identify those judges who have the strong association between white and good and black and bad, would they treat that litigant differently? And we also, because we had a large number of African American judges in this group, we were able actually to compare judges who had the opposite association, who associate black and good and white and bad. Okay, so we had 2 cases actually. We had a shoplifter and an armed robber. So we have a violent and a nonviolent juvenile crime. And then we asked the judges to identify an appropriate disposition for this defendant on a 7-point scale. 1 being just yell at the kid and dismiss the case. 7 being transfer the kid to adult court, which would be the most serious thing that judges could do in juvenile court. And then we had various versions of probation and punishment on the scale as well. Right. So what we're doing is we're asking the judges to sentence a defendant. We're either priming them to think of the defendant as white or black. So we're not telling them which race it is, but we're getting them to think of the person as white or black subtly without just outright saying it. So what we're trying to do is not trigger their defensive reaction that we think we see in other cases. We're trying them to just sort of think white-black. And then we know, do they have a strong black, good, white, bad association or not? So here's what we get. Among the judges who are primed to think that the defendant is white, I call it neutral here, but we believe the judges are thinking this defendant is white. The more closely they associate white and good and black and bad, the less punishment they inflict on this defendant. This is the shoplifter. The opposite happens. It's a small effect, but it's the opposite when they think of the person as black. Right? So in other words, they are treating the defendants differently, but it's here they're not on guard because we're being subtle about it. The same was true with the armed robber. If anything, the effect's a little stronger. And it's a small effect, but notice really what they're deciding on here is the person being detained or not? Are they going to be on probation? And so many more of the judges switch whether they want the person confined or not after this violent crime based on our understanding of their implicit association and whether we've gotten them to think of the defendant as white or black. It's a complicated study, but it shows us that bias is there. It's waiting to be tapped, and all that happens is if the judges are not on guard, then they are expressing that bias. When they are on guard, when we say, this is a black kid, when we're very explicit about it, then they're very defensive and they avoid the bias, which is a key to de-biasing. We want them to feel that way in the courtroom. We tell them, whatever you're reacting to us, do that when you're presiding over a real case. Okay. Let me give you one other study, and then maybe we'll stop. This was a real attempt to be subtle with the judges, but kind of be in their face about the results. We gave judges this picture early on in a presentation. So what I did is I told the judges, I'm going to put a picture up on the screen, and I want you to look at it for 5 seconds. And then an hour from now, I'm going to ask you a question about it. Didn't tell them what it was. So I just have them look at the picture. The key is this face. This face has actually been photoshopped in there. If you look closely, you probably can tell it's been photoshopped in. But it's a very busy street scene from New York City, and we put that face on that person. And we did that for a reason. So the judges just see this photograph, though, without the circle. And then an hour later, we tell them we're going to give them a lineup. What I tell them is, I say, remember that street scene I showed you an hour ago? One of the faces in that street scene belongs to a criminal defendant that's been accused of a crime. And I want you to read about the crime. And so for half the judges, the crime is described as the armed robbery of a gas station. The perpetrator waves a gun, fires it off in the air, and steals $170 from a gas station. Okay, so half the judges read about that crime, and I tell them they're going to get a lineup. They're going to have to pick out the offender. The other half are reading about a different crime. The crime is a fraud. They're told that a person is going door to door pretending to be collecting money from a charity, but there is no charity. He's the charity. Right? So he's defrauding, and he's being charged with defrauding an elderly woman out of $170. So it's a nonviolent crime, sort of an ordinary white-collar sort of crime, we would call it in the United States. And we say, look, we're going to ask you to identify the perpetrator. And I give them this lineup. Okay, so I've actually reordered it. I do it two ways. I show them the faces and the numbers, in the order in which I show the faces are the numbers. But I've reordered the lineup here. The reordering, it does depend a bit on the light. The reordering is along a particular spectrum. These faces have been rated by undergraduates on, this is the quote, the degree to which they are stereotypically African American faces. So if you get undergraduates in the United States and you give them these photographs, and you say, I want you to rate these photographs as stereotypically African American or not. First, undergraduates will say, I don't know what you mean, because that's politically incorrect. They don't want to do that. We say, no, you can do it. Just do it. We're not taking names here. And if you notice, the face on the right, it's a little hard with the lighting here. The face on the far right is darker skin, particularly than number one. He's got a thicker nose and thicker lips. The person next to him is still fairly dark skinned, but has thinner lips and a smaller nose. The guy in the middle is sort of a median African-American face, and he's the face I photoshopped into the lineup. The guy next to him is fairly light-skinned, looks a little more, has more white features we associate with European Americans. The guy on the far left, and I've sometimes substituted a different one there, just a very light-skinned African American. But that person looks more South Indian, more Asian a bit than South Indian Asian than African American, so wouldn't be associated with African Americans. Okay, I've reordered them here because I'm not actually interested in how accurate the judges are. A third of the judges, regardless of the crime, managed to pick out the target. That's pretty good, because actually it's a hard task. So they are paying attention. What I'm interested in is the errors. What do they do when they don't know? Because I insist they give an answer, and I really push them on that. I said, I know you might not know. Make your best guess. Okay? Here's what happens. When the crime is a fraud, 80% of the judges who get it wrong choose one of the non-stereotypic African-American faces. Only 20% choose the ones on the right. When the crime is an armed robbery, 75% of the judges choose one of the more stereotypically African-American faces. What I tell the judges, those are the faces of an armed robber. Those are the faces of someone who can go door to door and convince someone to give them money. Or at least that's what your brain is telling you. Right? So that bias is really there. And the judges really hate that result, but it's because it is really in their face, in a sense. The result is completely inverted. The errors are not random. They're picking out faces they think of as looking like armed robbers or looking like people who can commit fraud, and they're different. And of course, they know nothing about these people, right? These are just photographs, but they're relying very, very heavily on what they look like. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there. More debiasing strategies. I was asked about a couple of these. Is it appropriate for judges perhaps to just blind themselves to the race of litigants? There are some really clever studies about blinding, where you just don't know the race or gender of a party, that really show that the effects kind of disappear. I think this is nearly impossible for judges. I've had some appellate judges say that they don't know the race of the party. The problem is, to me, that what I worry about is that race is subtly implicated by many facts about a case. So for a trial judge, the litigant is going to appear in front of you, right? That you're going to have a guess about the race, even if it's complicated. And identifying Latinos, in particular in the United States, is not obvious. That black and white people are pretty good at, that we have clear categories. Latino is a little more complicated in the United States. So it actually, some judges will say that they can't identify Latinos versus whites or even versus black. But you do get more complicated effects with Latino. But they, by and large, it's hard for a trial judge to blind him or herself to the race of the party. But appellate judges say that they can, but I think they're wrong. Because facts of a case will identify where a crime occurred or where the litigant lives. They'll have the person's name there as well. And in the United States, name is often a cue to race or ancestry. And the problem for me is that's a little like what we did in one of our studies, right, where we subtly suggested a race, and then we found a really big effect of race or race relative to where we were overt and explicit about identifying race. For me, I'd rather judges just recognize the race of the party. Don't pretend you don't know, because most of the time we kind of do know. Does discussing the bias help? We tell judges to be explicit about it. Admit that you're going to have these associations. We strongly encourage judges to take the implicit association test. One of its great strengths is you can go online. There are websites on which you can take an implicit association test yourself. There are dozens of them. Various involving, some involve race, some involve gender, some involve age. There's a whole range of them on there. And it's really easy to sort of self-diagnose oneself with implicit biases. And we strongly encourage judges to just do that on their own. We actually know that 3 members of our United States Supreme Court have done this. Have gone online and taken the implicit association test. The people who run the websites know who they are, but won't reveal it. But we know it's 3 of them have done that. And we think that's helpful to sort of confront the fact that we do harbor biases and try to be that defensive judge that doesn't, in fact, implement them. one thing that I was asked about by Alexandra is, well, is it helpful to have a more diverse judiciary? In a way, you're kind of stuck with the judiciary you have if you're a researcher, but we think diversity sort of helps, but sort of doesn't. So many of the jurisdictions I work with in the United States are shockingly homogenous. In a society that is in some ways obsessed with race, which the United States is at times, it's really remarkable for me that I go to the state of Ohio in the year 2018, 85% of their judges are white men. And you almost want to ask, how did you do that? It's hard to get 85% white males in anything anymore. The United States, whites are 60% of the population, and men are, of course, half. And yet, Ohio still manages, one way or another, to get mostly white males as judges. Other jurisdictions in the U.S. are much more diverse, but even ones that are still troublesome. So I got in trouble at one of my judge education talks by presenting some of this research, and a judge in the audience asked the question, look, our jurisdiction is incredibly diverse. We're half white and half African American. There are very few Latinos in this particular city. It's a city that does not have a large Latino population, but does have a large black population. And he said, our judges are, half of them are white and half of them are black. That's pretty good. We're doing great here. I don't know, we're the wrong audience, is what he said to us. And I couldn't help it. I'm standing up in front of a room. I'm on a podium. They're sitting at round tables. And I said, look at the people at the table you're sitting at. Because I had noticed the tables were perfectly segregated. There was no mixed table. The black judges were all at their own tables, and the white judges all at their own tables. They were really angry. But in fact, they hadn't noticed that. They don't actually mingle with each other. So diversity by itself is not much of a cure. What we often tell judges to do, if they're concerned about bias, is to be diverse in their hiring decisions, to hire clerks that are different from them demographically. And diversity comes in a lot of different forms: a different gender, a different race, different socioeconomic status. Judges, I think, in the United States get a lot of value of people who work with them. Clerks in the United States are assistants to judges. They help them write opinions. They help them do legal research. Sometimes they are career clerks who work for them for many years. Sometimes they're temporary, like interns for 1 or 2 years. We tell judges that's a tremendous opportunity. You by yourself cannot be diverse. You're one person with one race and one gender, but your office can be very different. And exposing yourself to different perspectives will really be a good debiasing strategy. So that's look at your court employees, that they're not the same race and gender, and interact with them a bit more. So I want to conclude because I'm already talked too much. What do we get from our research? Judges, like most adults, harbor implicit biases. We can measure them. They do affect judgment. Not always. Judges are often on guard. And they sometimes suppress these biases and think differently. But we can find these biases in judges with a little bit of work and a little bit of creativity in our methods, and it does affect their judgment in the right setting. And it's probably not that surprising that it does, but we're quite interested in the fact that they are able to suppress that in at least some contexts. So I should stop talking and take more questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that. Si quieren, abrimos ahorita una pequeña sesión para poder responder algunas preguntas o también comentarios o también dudas metodológicas que puedan tener respecto a las investigaciones que puedan estar realizando. Si nos ayudan con sus manos levantadas para que podamos ir recuperando algunas cuestiones, empezamos por acá. Si llegaron tarde y no se presentaron, por favor, preséntense en 1 minuto.
Gracias. Me interesa lo que es el estudio de género que hizo entre la paternidad-maternidad, y llama mi atención, por ejemplo, que comentaba, ¿no?, en sus resultados, que las mujeres ya no es como tan arraigado que tengan que permanecer en la casa, que se pueden ir, pero hay otra parte que llamó mi atención, que es precisamente que se asocia a la mujer con buena madre, y el padre, como no tan buen padre, y eso llamó mi atención. ¿Por qué? Porque comentaba, ¿no?, que los jueces decían, la mujer puede ir a donde quiera con los hijos, pero si el hijo se enferma, entonces ella va a dejar la cuestión del trabajo y va a ejercer su maternidad activa. Entonces aquí llama mi atención el sesgo precisamente cognitivo de creer que la mujer va a ser buena madre por el solo hecho de ser mujer, y el padre por el solo hecho de interesarse por la parte más de desarrollarse profesionalmente no va a ser buen padre. Entonces, ¿cómo esto afecta al momento de decidir con quién van a dejar la custodia del menor? ¿Sí? Porque aquí es basado en la generalidad de que la mujer es buena madre, o en considerando específicamente que esta mujer es una buena madre y que por eso voy a decidir el bienestar del menor con ella. Pero ¿qué pasa si quien realmente está ejerciendo la paternidad activa es él, y quién es él el que podría contribuir más al crecimiento del menor, y ella podría desarrollarse y tal vez no ser tan buena madre? No sé si me explico. Esa parte, esa variable me parecería muy interesante explotarla. Y así podríamos como ya quitar un poquito esa cuestión del sesgo cognitivo en ese sentido. Y la otra es, ¿cuál sería como la recomendación precisamente para disminuir estos sesgos y no seguirnos basando en el género de que la mujer es buena madre y el padre no es tan buen padre, o no puede solventar todas esas necesidades, no solo económicas, sino también afectivas del menor?
Gracias.
Good. I like that study a lot because it's not what we predicted at the outset. And we've been very slow to publish it because we're not quite sure what to say about it. What's interesting to me about the results and what we learned from talking to the judges is how, I guess, that they weren't even remotely embarrassed by expressing that bias, right? It seemed to them appropriate that they thought of the mothers differently than the fathers. If we said that about race, they're very defensive. They don't want to say anything. But here, they didn't seem to think this was a problem. And so that's a difficult bias to get past then, to get them to think about, to evaluate the litigants on their own terms, to evaluate the mother as a single individual, as a person who might be different than other mothers, and the father as well. I think the real challenge in a lot of family court cases is to get judges to put aside their own beliefs about how the world works and to really try to evaluate the litigants as themselves, because frankly, here's an area where judges actively resist debiasing. Those judges really saw nothing wrong with that result. They think it's perfectly appropriate. And of course, in this context, it happened to favor the litigant who got what she wanted when she was a woman, but not the father. But in many other contexts, it's quite a destructive bias to harbor about how we think men and women should live their lives, because that's what family court judges is doing. I don't have a good answer to that, because I think that the debiasing the judges there requires changing their motivation a little, to really think that they're wrong about their bias, because they don't. Now, I'm comforted partly in those results also by having identified a group of judges who do not have the same implicit association that actually a majority of adults in the United States and Canada do. So remember, we had a few judges who don't have the male career, female home association, and they treated the litigants the same. And I think if I need to follow up more with those judges to ask, how do they think about the cases differently? Because the judges who told me that they thought the mother would she'd still take care of those kids if she worked. The father, they were nervous about him. They didn't say he was necessarily a bad parent, but they were focused on the experiences the children would have, and they thought that they would be made worse off if the father went back to work. That they are implicitly judging the dad as being more a careerist than the mom, and implicitly judging the mom as being less interested in her career. Those group of judges, I think I need to find a way to convince them that that is a bias that's not appropriate, because they don't think that. They think it's perfectly fine. And it's kind of a shocking study for me in some ways, to have judges be willing to embrace a very stereotypic bias about how the world should function. And I don't have a good answer to your question in a way, because I don't have a way of getting judges to think differently about the world. But I do know there are judges that don't think that way, and they're in that sample as well. By the way, that bias doesn't correlate with being male or female. Right, so it's not that the women were the judges who treated the men and women differently. There are as many men among the low bias judges as there are women. It didn't correlate with their gender. So it's not that having more women judges is going to help. It's judges who are willing to at least recognize the bias is actually a bias and not a sensible belief about the world. Because what they really need to do, what a judge owes a litigant, is to judge them on their own individual case, not on their category, male or female. And the judges know that, and I think it's partly how I had this exchange with one of the other professors here earlier. Is there a way we can get judges to think a little differently? Maybe recognize they need to be egalitarian all the time. Because our judges, when we do studies on race, do embrace an egalitarian equal norm. They don't on gender in family court cases, though. So it's a challenge. I know that was an unsatisfying answer. I'm sorry.
Just a follow-up commentary question to that case, because when I saw the results, I remember some of the research, some other research on gender differences. And I don't know if there's also some kind of penalty in terms of masculinity to men, in terms of what was the role, and if the man was taking care of the children. Somehow, for some judges, that could be a problem also.
Well, in that case, it is actually a penalty for being a man. And there's actually a lot of data in the United States on custody choices that show that mothers are definitely heavily favored. There, in many cases, there may be good reasons for that, but the disparities are so big that it's hard to explain by just individual variations in the cases, and easier to explain if we assume that they're being biased. In this case, it's definitely operating as a penalty on the man. We have a few studies about men and women being treated differently in the workplace that run the opposite, of course. That women are suffering bias when they're being judged on how career-oriented they are. Whereas here, we've, of course, reversed it because they're being judged on how good they're going to be at at domestic workers, essentially. And the father is getting a penalty there. Most...
so it's also a bias.
Yeah, it's definitely a bias.
It's another bias, but
well, because, of course, here, like, the facts are identical. Right, the story about the custodial parent, you recognize the way I described the case. It actually takes a little practice to describe the case without using a gender pronoun, to just say custodial parent over and over, and then at the end identify that we varied it. I mean, it's because the facts of the case are absolutely identical, and all we're doing is changing the names of the person to be a male or a female name, or husband or wife, or mother or father. The judges, if they're judging the person on their own individual characteristics, have no basis to just decide one way or the other against a parent, because it has to be their gender, and it is what they're doing, but they're not embarrassed about it.
Okay, thank you. ¿Alguien más por acá? Atrás, y después acá, y después allá.
Bueno, primero, Alexandra, gracias por traer esta perspectiva aquí a México. Y la pregunta concreta es la siguiente. ¿Hay algún estudio que ustedes hayan hecho vinculado a estos sesgos con personalidad de los jueces? Esa es la primera. Y la segunda, yo en este momento tengo acceso a jueces del Poder Judicial de Oaxaca. Y estaba pensando si la variable indígena no tiene un peso en la muestra, digamos.
So on personality differences, not a lot. The only individual variation I tend to study in judges is the degree to which they harbor this implicit bias. There are, of course, many personality differences one might study in judges. It's just not something I've really pursued. So I don't have much of an answer to that. My goal partly is to make all judges better judges. So I don't have a lot on that. On studying judges, I don't know Oaxaca very well, but my guess is, from what I know of Mexico and reading about it, that if you're going to find implicit biases, it might be in exactly the way you describe. People who tend to use a different language, who tend not to be as fully integrated. In the United States, those are signals for implicit bias. That is how that's the group that you will see an implicit bias against. And it's certainly, if you like to collect research or collect data, I can share with you any of our materials. You can translate them and use them how you'd like. I'd be very, very happy to help you out. It'd be really wonderful to see more international, more studies that aren't just in the U.S. on how biases work, and we have a lot to learn, because biases might work differently in different places, and it would be really valuable to do. So please get in touch with me. I'd be happy to help.
Yo nada más, si quieres, extiendo ahí un poquito respecto a la población indígena, ¿no? Si se meten a esta plataforma donde se hace la prueba de sesgos implícitos, bueno, la que yo conozco es Project Implicit, que es una plataforma que tiene ya varios años, creo que es la que presentó ahorita Jeffrey, y digamos que está alojada, empezó con un grupo de investigadores y psicólogos en Harvard, y está alojada en Harvard y ya tiene muchos años, y se han hecho muchos de estos tests en todo el mundo, digamos. Entonces es gratuita, uno puede meterse. Nosotros hemos estado tratando de trabajar con esta plataforma. Hay que hacer varias alianzas, digamos, con la gente que está llevando a cabo la plataforma, y hay un investigador aquí mexicano que trató de hacer un ejercicio para el caso mexicano, haciendo una prueba de sesgo implícito, y además, digamos, y cambió un poco la mecánica. Son 3 categorías, generalmente es dicotómica, y es como nos lo explicó Jeffrey, pero él la trató de hacer con población europea, población mestiza y población indígena. Hay problemas, digamos, en el diseño de esos ejercicios, porque las fotografías para población indígena y mestiza no son muy diferentes, y en realidad lo que hizo fue una tropicalización, que más que una tropicalización, digamos, por ejemplo, de las preguntas, lo que hizo fue una traducción literal, que tampoco nos ayuda mucho, porque no tenemos republicanos y demócratas, o sea, hay muchos elementos que no funcionan. Y entonces nosotros hemos estado pensando en cómo tratar de mejorar ese ejercicio, porque además también el ejercicio, desde mi perspectiva, es un poco limitado, que también es una de mis preguntas a Jeffrey, ¿no? O sea, sí creo que es una plataforma y es una prueba que tiene que complementarse con otras pruebas, ¿no? Porque un poco lo que mide la plataforma es una preferencia, es un poco lo que nos explicaba Jeffrey, ¿no? No quiere decir el hecho de que tú tengas una preferencia hacia la población blanca, quiere decir que seas racista, ¿no? Sino que, bueno, cultural, sociohistóricamente, estamos en una sociedad colonialista en donde ha habido una preferencia hacia personas de piel blanca. Y eso, digamos, está impresa en nuestra cabeza y en nuestro sistema cognitivo. Entonces, digamos, es un instrumento muy útil, ¿no? Porque en efecto te da ciertas cuestiones. Entonces, lo que ese test que elaboró este investigador nos dice es que, en efecto, digamos, hay un sesgo implícito hacia la población indígena en este país. Eso es lo que sí sabemos. La otra cuestión que tú estabas abordando un poco sobre los jueces indígenas, ¿no? Nosotros hemos estado buscando, y en realidad, digamos, en el ámbito federal no identificamos a un solo juez que se identifique como indígena. Evidentemente debe de haber personas que vengan de origen indígena, pero que no se autoasuman como indígenas. Ese es un problema. Sí sabemos, digamos, que está todo el sistema judicial indígena, digamos, ¿no? Que en realidad se aplica hacia sus propias comunidades. Entonces ahí tendríamos otro tipo de situaciones que se puedan medir. Lo que sí sabemos también, ¿no?, y que es mucho lo que pasa, por ejemplo, con la población afroamericana, es que hay sesgos implícitos, digamos, no nada más hacia grupos externos o endogrupos, sino también hacia el mismo grupo, ¿no? Es decir, los indígenas o los afroamericanos muchas veces también tienen este sesgo implícito en contra, ¿no?, de su propio grupo étnico, ¿no? Y esto también es un problema, ¿no? Y que es algunas de las cuestiones que habría también que medir. El problema en México, y por eso mi pregunta respecto a la diversidad, ¿no?, en el ámbito judicial, es que evidentemente no tenemos, ¿no?, jueces indígenas en donde podamos hacer una serie de estudios para ver, digamos, si hay un trato diferenciado hacia población blanca, hacia población indígena, afromestiza, porque pues porque no hay esa movilidad, no hay esa oportunidad toda. O sea, todavía creo que tenemos un sistema terriblemente desigual, digamos, en su base, que no está permitiendo que personas indígenas lleguen ahí.
Creo que tenemos una gran beta de oportunidad en el Poder Judicial de Oaxaca, porque yo capacito a estos jueces en materia de psicología jurídica con mucha frecuencia y los conozco a casi todos. Y ellos, o sea, Oaxaca tiene 8 regiones. Y hay una parte mixteca, zapoteca, costa, istmo, cuenca, papaloapan, y ellos se identifican como población indígena y además están orgullosos de haber cambiado la movilidad social, que es muy difícil de lograr. Es decir, ellos se asumen como indígenas y a pesar de la adversidad son jueces. Yo creo que es una muestra muy valiosa, que es muy distinta a la muestra norteamericana y que además tiene una variable cultural muy, muy interesante, que es la cuestión incluso del mestizaje, pero muchos de ellos conservan la raíz propia indígena. Entonces, sí me gustaría después, Alexandra, a través de ti, comunicarme con el profesor para que pudiéramos intercambiar una ruta metodológica práctica que nos permitiera evaluar esta muestra. Ellos están interesados son curiosos, les llama la atención la psicología jurídica y están dispuestos a participar. Entonces, creo que es una buena oportunidad para la investigación y para ellos mismos.
Claro.
Excellent.
Y tal vez, digamos, añadiendo, haciendo una pregunta a partir de lo que estás comentando y que me parecería muy interesante, Jeffrey. Yo creo que ya con estos 2 días nos has dado como ciertos elementos metodológicos, pero me gustaría un poquito que abordaras un poco más esta parte metodológica, ¿no? De cómo realmente juntar los elementos, diseñar, digamos, o sea, cuáles son como aquellos elementos que hay que tomar en cuenta para un diseño metodológico de una investigación sobre sesgos cognitivos en el ámbito judicial. Eso creo que sería como muy interesante. Ya sabemos que hay una experiencia por acá que están haciendo con cuestiones específicas, pero creo que hay también muchas otras inquietudes y creo que sería interesante que nos platicaras un poquito sobre cómo construyes tú cada uno de estos casos de investigación.
Well, I would say that the thing to think about in a research design is really start with what you think of as an important question in the world. So for us on gender bias, we started with observations judges gave us about how family court worked and what they thought. And judges who were willing to be open and talk to us about what they were concerned about said that they really thought they did incorporate their own gender stereotype beliefs about the world into their decisions and found it very difficult to get past them. So we then tried to write problems that we thought would trigger gender stereotypes and demonstrate them in those judges who weren't so open and willing to discuss it. On the race side in the United States, we know from research on sentencing that there are enormous sentencing disparities by race in the United States. We know that's a problem judges themselves worry about, and so we began crafting problems that were meant to get at that. And so I would advise really anyone wanting to study judges, really what you ought to start with is ask the judges what they see as a problem in their system. You get try to identify the more open-minded judges who are concerned about how justice is dispensed in their system. What do they see as the biggest problems? Most of the problems we have, we did not give to groups of judges without asking judges first whether they thought these reflected real issues that they encountered in the courtroom. So in a way, this is not meant to be a slight to the psychologists in the audience. We start out trying to give judges something that they want to hear and that they want to know about, more so than what psychologists want to know about them. I actually get that criticism a lot from my research about psychologists, saying you're not really digging into the psychological mechanisms very well. Well, sometimes I'm not, but it's because I really want to speak to the judges. I want to give them a problem that they worry about. And I learn so much more from judges than I do from anybody else. I used to say this, that when I ask people, what would you ask a judge? If you had, say, 300 judges you could give a question to or a hypothetical to, what would you want to do? Because there were times, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm bragging, there were times where I had more access to judges than I quite knew what to do with. That I would get, because I get invited to these judicial education conferences, and I don't control when I can collect data. It's very strange. Like for psychologists, it's you have the theory and then you go out and get no, I have the subjects and I've got to do something with them. But so I would ask people, just researchers, what would you ask a judge, and try to glean ideas. I would say that when I ask lawyers what they want to study in judges, I have never used a single problem lawyers have given me. They're never quite right. These are, I mean here, law professors. What they always ask something about their own area of law, and as I said, judges get, in most cases, a reasonable education about areas of law. That's not what I'm trying to do, so that's not very useful to me. When I ask psychologists what to study, I've used about half of the problems they've given me. So about half the time a psychologist will give me something that is so basic, so foundational research to some psychological theory that I can understand why psychologists would want to know that, but it's not going to be helpful directly to judges. The other half of the time they're pretty good, actually. They've identified a problem they think is common. When judges answer the question, what would you ask other judges, I have used every single problem judges have given me somewhere in the research. I have... Actually, it's not in this talk, but I have a whole paper on apologies. How do apologies affect judges? When a litigant or a defendant apologizes to a judge, how does it affect them? That came directly from a comment a judge gave me. It said, I think you should study apologies, because I sit on the bench, and it seems to me every defendant I'm sentencing is sorry. They all say they're sorry. And I don't think they're very sorry. And, I used to think they were, but now I don't anymore. And it occurs to me that I've become very jaded. That some of them clearly are really remorseful, but it doesn't have any effect on me anymore. And I don't react the way a human being reacts to an apology. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So we started to study apologies, and indeed, he was right. Judges seem completely unmoved by very passionate apologies. Because everybody's sorry. Whereas ordinary adults, when someone does something terribly wrong, like involved in a horrible crime, and they're remorseful, we're really moved by that. Judges don't care. They just see it too often, and they've just gotten jaded about it. And that's kind of interesting. And so that's something a judge observed that we otherwise would not have figured out on our own. With regard to research in Oaxaca, I mean, I would suggest, what do the judges worry about? I mean, and some of it also is look at the data. Do you see massive disparities in outcomes with indigenous peoples versus people who identify as indigenous or people who don't? That would be something judges would worry about. So we start with the real data in the world too. What kind of trends do we see out there? And because we're trying to identify what role judges play in outcomes that we don't think are acceptable in our judicial system. And we talk to judges themselves about what do they care about, what worries them. Because, an experienced judge who is thoughtful and contemplative and worries about their legal system is a treasure trove of understanding. They've thought about it, and they've lived it, and they've been there in the trenches. And to me, really, it's in some sense good psychology, because the best psychologists I know try to see the world through the eyes of their research subjects. It's not just about writing materials. It's what are people seeing in their heads when they see these materials. You really have to feel that. The best psychologists I know really can see the world through someone else's eyes. And that takes real work, but it takes talking to the people you're studying with. Actually, the funny thing is I get criticized sometimes for asking, like, don't you, these are very sort of rough hypotheticals with simple variations, they don't seem to capture the complexity of the world. Wouldn't you rather just talk to judges? Well, I talk to judges endlessly. Right, we are trying to operationalize the kind of observations judges make so that we're not just relying on the anecdote from one judge, but we are starting with them, with what do they see in their system? What does their courtroom look like to them? What kind of problems do they think they encounter? And that to me is the foundation of a good research program on judges, just talking to them at the outset. And a good relationship with a judge is really what you really need at the outset. It's very difficult for us on the outside to see the world the way judges do. They do see the world differently. I started that with that comment yesterday, that judges are people who decide to make difficult choices for a living. That makes them unusual at the outset. You know, most of us hate making choices. I mean, imagine if your job were every day to stand in front of people and decide who got custody of a child, whether or not to send someone to prison for 5 years or 10. What would that do to you year after year? You'd be a very different person, and it's hard to put yourself in that person's perspective. And so we spend a lot of time talking to judges. So it's a strange answer, I guess, to a methodological question. But it's like, oh, talk to your research subjects. But and you'll see in some of, now I think what you were getting at a little bit more was how we use implicit biases and the like, particularly when we're studying race. You see, we really are trying to be very creative with it, right? The simple things we do don't tell us as much. So just writing a hypothetical where you sentence one defendant or another and you vary the race of that person, you know, in the United States, we don't see much in terms of differences, but there are real differences in the world, so that creates a puzzle. And so then we try to look at things in a different way. I really like that, the eyewitness study where we show the picture, because I don't know, I can't remember whether the judge I work with or I thought of that one, or it was someone else. You know, a lot of times we piece these together from different kinds of thinking. But if you just deeply believe that everyone has this bias, that someone looks like something, then you can get at that somehow. And that research design is meant to do that, to say that do the judges have a mental impression of what an armed robber of a gas station looks like? The answer is actually yes, they do have an impression. And if you ask a few judges, they're a little reticent to tell you that. But they do have that. And so that study is meant to get at that particular phenomena in a different way. And you've got to be a little creative with some of these things to try to translate it and the like. We actually, the other thing I can reveal here, since you've asked about methodology, we probably have at least as many studies we haven't done as we have, and that we're probably not going to do, because the psychology doesn't translate that well to the legal system. Right? There are particular observations that psychologists have about how people think that we can't find legal applications for. That psychologists, this is the 50% that the psychologists tell us that we don't use. It just doesn't translate well. Sometimes it's because the legal system just doesn't work the way you think the psychologist thinks it does, or that even we sometimes think it does. And not doing the study if it doesn't sound right is probably a pretty good instinct too. So that if you really have to, rewrite the scenario over and over and over again, and it just doesn't sound right, and we run it by a judge and goes, I don't know what this is supposed to get at, then it's probably not right. Once in a while, we'll run a study where we'll get the research back, and I really like doing this on paper. It's the oldest technology imaginable and kind of stupid. And my oldest son, who's a computer scientist, says, why are you doing this on paper? All the judges have phones. You could write an app, and then we'd see the stimuli, and you could answer. I said, it's just got to be paper. Partly judges work on paper, but also they write stuff in the margins. I've learned a ton from what they write in the margins. And sometimes we run a problem, and it's clearly not right, because all we get is writing in the margins. We don't get our answer to our question. They write all kinds of things that criticize the problem, and you have to listen to your research subjects. When they are rewriting your problem for you instead of answering your question, you didn't ask the right question. And so we've thrown out some data like that where it's all marginalia. it's all stuff written in the margins, and this isn't right. That we have to rethink this and read what they said, because that's valuable information. So,
Very good.
all right, that was
Tenemos
too
una
much.
por aquí enfrente, ¿verdad? Y luego allá y luego acá. Creo que primero estaba acá enfrente, Gil. Sí. Estoy manteniendo el orden.
Yo tengo dos preguntas rápidas. Primero es con respecto a la injusticia. Parece que una de las razones por las que su investigación nos resulta tan relevante es porque muestra que los jueces suelen tomar decisiones que afectan a la gente basados en intuiciones o en razones inapropiadas. Pero la decisión sesgada de un juez es parte de un problema sistémico. La misma evidencia nos muestra que estos sesgos afectan desde denuncias ciudadanas, oficiales, interrogatorios, registros, etc. De modo que cuando un juez toma una decisión, ya recibe una interpretación sesgada de la realidad, ¿no? Y yo creo que esto limita el alcance de las estrategias para reducir los sesgos. No sé si existe o si usted ha pensado en estrategias más bien transversales o sistémicas para reducir los sesgos. Y la segunda es que la evidencia también parece sugerir que muchos de estos sesgos tienen en la base la idea de la empatía, que parece que es más fácil para nosotros tomar perspectiva o ser empáticos con personas que son parecidas a nosotros. Pienso, por ejemplo, en sesgos raciales. Y entonces yo me pregunto si no hay estrategias, en lugar de implementar estrategias aisladas para cada sesgo, sino es más bien una estrategia que promueva la empatía, en lugar de neutralizar o calibrar los juicios de los jueces o cegarlos ante cierta información, más bien entrenar o algo así al sistema 1, de tal manera que funcione de manera empática.
Thank you for those. I'm not sure the second one is a quick question, but and it's maybe not. You may have noticed quick answer is not my style. But I'll try on the first one. Basically, I absolutely agree that the good example in the United States, the disparities we see in sentencing by race really could not just be attributable to the judge. It has to be about who police decide to arrest, which arrests prosecutors decide to pursue, how prosecutors decide to charge those defendants, and what often they're called probation officers, often what recommendations they make to judges. So there are a good 4 or 5 steps in the process before the judge gets anywhere near the case. So much so that if the judge herself is unbiased, you'd still see enormous disparities in sentencing. There's no question that's true. I just really, I've focused my work on judges not because I don't think those other things are important, but that's a methodology I've gotten good at, and so I think the judges are critical to the system. They're also, if they're concerned about that, central points of reforms of the other parts of the system. I tell judges this often: you observe these other actors, and many of them are operating with very little oversight or discretion unless you oversee them. So if you tell your probation officer that these sentence recommendations are very different based on the race of the parties, you're probably the first person to tell them that. And so to me, it's not my target of research, but the judges are central to the system that they're operating. And to me, if a judge doesn't like the output of his court, he has a responsibility to work on the other actors in the system as well. That's not to say there isn't a lot of work to be done on that. Life is short, and I do what I can. On the second question, I think that's a very difficult question. It's how does a judge be empathetic to everyone? The real answer is they can't. I mean, my example on apologies is evidence of that you just cannot break down and cry over every litigant who walks into your courtroom. That's just not possible for a judge. No human could do that. And judges themselves will say that they feel sometimes where they're listening to a case and they should be empathetic, but they're not. They're tired. They've heard it before. It's another criminal defendant who's sorry. You're sorry you got caught. They'll sometimes say that. And then they'll say later, I really should have been empathetic. It was a very heart-rending story, but nothing happened. And empathy is a strange thing. You can't force yourself to be empathetic, right? It's a core emotion that a story can make you empathetic or not. It's a strange example about this. So I went to see this movie, the Avengers, recently, the new Avengers, which everyone on the planet apparently has seen. My children went to see it. I didn't particularly like it, I have to say. I won't give you any spoilers, but a character does die in the end. Now, I won't tell you who, if you haven't seen it. The person behind me in the movie theater was sobbing actively. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, it's a cartoon character. It's not a real person. Why are you sobbing? And really, they were uncontrolled. And like, oh, like, what is going on? That person had a strange empathetic, and this actually weirdly happens in movies. People cry in movies in ways they wouldn't in the real world. But I thought, well, you know, it is kind of sad, and it went on at length. And I just could not bring. I said, let me try to see if I can. I couldn't feel it. Now, of course, it's not a real character, but that's what judges have experienced sometimes, that they just can't get it. So I don't have a magic one-size-fits-all solution, meaning the harder question is, what are judges supposed to do with empathy? I don't want to tell judges not to be empathetic in those cases that they are, and I can't tell them realistically to be empathetic in all cases. So I don't actually have a good answer to that, and it's something I've struggled with for a few years and asked a lot of judges about, and not gotten a set of clear answers to yet. It may be an endemic part of our system, or any system of justice, that a judge will sometimes sit there and weep over the character who's dying, and sometimes sit there and go, what are you crying about? And it's not clear how we get to one or the other. I would at least like to get to a system where that empathetic reaction did not depend on the race or gender of the judge. And so that's maybe a more limited goal. Like, how can we get to that, where a judge's empathy is triggered by an unusual set of events, perhaps, or some reason to be more empathetic than they would normally, and it's not just because they recognize their son in that litigant. That's really, I think, a more modest goal, and that I have to think a little more about, but maybe more achievable.
Tenemos por allá y luego acá.
Buenas tardes, doctor Jeffrey. Bueno, mi pregunta va más enfocada a, bueno, con lo que usted nos ha presentado hemos podido ver que los jueces hacen juicios y en base a eso toman sus decisiones en cuestión a las anclas y a cómo se le presenta la información a las personas, ¿no? De cómo se le presenta la información a ellos. Y bueno, por esto podemos intuir que también se ven muy influenciados con sus experiencias previas y con su entorno sociocultural, y también podríamos intuir que usan heurístico de disponibilidad y el de representatividad. Pero mi pregunta va más enfocada a si también puede influir a lo mejor en su juicio o en su toma de decisiones el tono de voz con que la víctima, el acusado y los abogados de estos están ejerciendo como un juicio oral en ese momento. O sea, ¿su voz puede influir en esto? Si sí, ¿qué tanto y cómo? Y bueno, otra cosa un poco más trivial, pues no sé si conozca usted en persona al doctor Daniel Kahneman, y sí, pues me gustaría que pues hay, en algún momento en que usted lo vea, le diga que pues hay una joven loca de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México que le manda saludos y muchas felicitaciones por su gran colaboración en lo que es las ciencias cognitivas y del comportamiento. Gracias.
I have met Daniel. I actually worked with his collaborator Amos Tversky in graduate school long ago, and met Daniel Kahneman later. Amos Tversky was on my dissertation committee and was a brilliant man, and a great loss that he died relatively young. Kahneman is a lovely individual, of course, very gregarious, a wonderful psychologist. That point I made earlier about listen to your subjects, see the world from their point of view, that's very much Daniel Kahneman. He has an amazing capacity to see through people's reasoning and see where it's gone astray and where it's gone right. That I don't know how you teach. I wish you could teach. He has a vast collection of students and admirers who try to imitate what he does to varying degrees of success, and it's impressive. The first question, I think, was a little bit on, I had a little trouble with it, but I think it's on the role of the lawyers in there. It's not something we've particularly studied, but something really anyone who is worried about justice should worry about. Now there's multiple sides to it. To what extent can a lawyer really restructure a case to sort of trigger a cognitive, a favorable way of thinking about a case? I think that's really what smart lawyers and clever lawyers do, is try to think about a case in a way that's going to be congenial to getting a judge to decide in their favor. That's much of the job of a lawyer. Does it involve triggering particular heuristics and cognitive biases? Actually, I think yes. I mean, the funny thing is when I don't often speak to groups of lawyers, but when I do, wow, are they taking notes? Okay, try that. They're very much looking for ways to push judges around. Judges repeatedly say to me that they are very annoyed when they see lawyers trying to play on their System 1 intuitions. As one judge put it, I hate when lawyers try to press my buttons. And I said to that judge, yeah, but you have buttons, right? There are ways of getting you to influence things. And what you're basically saying is you don't like the fact that you have that sort of back channel. I think that is what clever lawyers very much do. We, of course, in the United States, live with a legal system in which many people are unrepresented. They don't have lawyers. So they don't have people who even, they don't even understand the legal system, much less have a way of presenting their story to a judge in a way that's conducive to a judge. That's an increasing trend in the United States. About half of family court cases now get decided without any lawyers involved, which is kind of remarkable. That's just the two litigants in front of them, and that's a recipe for the judge just going with their instinct, because they're not even being presented with legal arguments at that point. Bankruptcy court is increasingly like that in the United States. Fewer and fewer lawyers, more and more people just representing themselves. And the problem then is it's hard for me to tell judges, look, rely on the law, rely on System 2, that don't rely on your biases, because that's kind of all they have. The parties in front of them aren't presenting legal arguments. They're not lawyers. They can't. And that's an unfortunate trend that we're suffering in the United States. And it is difficult to know what to do. The other thing I worry about, judges often say this, that they worry about deciding against the litigant because they really dislike the lawyer. They have an experience, they have a history with that attorney, they don't like them, and judges will tell me often, they try to see through that and just look, recognize it's a new litigant, they've hired a lawyer who's unsavory and disliked, but it's the litigant's argument. I don't have any data directly on that. We've thought about studying that, but I suspect that is a problem for many lawyers, that judges just don't like them, and they're going to react very badly to them. Judges, I know, try to get past that, and they try to use more complicated ways of thinking, but I'm not sure how successful they are.
Teníamos una por acá y creo que había otra por allá después. Acá, primero.
Muy buenas tardes. Una pregunta. Supongo que los jueces que están, que ha estudiado, son voluntarios o los asigna el Poder Judicial de Estados Unidos. ¿A qué voy con esto? ¿Cómo se controla el sesgo de deseabilidad? Porque, en el trabajo que yo desempeño, le comentaba que yo entrevisto jueces y como los asigna el Poder Judicial de cada estado, pues es muy difícil sacar una postura, digamos, personal y no que sea institucional, ¿no? Muchas veces nos recitan la ley cuando sienten que vamos a tocar un tema medio delicado, entonces es uno de los principales problemas que me he enfrentado en mi labor y me gustaría escuchar cómo se controla ese tipo de sesgo. Y la segunda pregunta es, ¿realmente como seres humanos estamos capacitados para implementar justicia? Me refiero a el desarrollo de inteligencias artificiales por parte, por ejemplo, de IBM, que empíricamente son más eficientes que 100 jueces al momento de hacer una resolución judicial. Entonces, solamente una pregunta ahí tecnológica. Gracias.
Good. That's a good question. Good. On the first question, so I guess in a sense all my judges are volunteers, but that's not really true. So I get judges when they're at judicial education conferences, so they'll have a full day of presentations, again, most of it on the content of law. We typically title our sessions something so completely nondescript that judges cannot possibly know what it's about. We'll call it something like judicial decision making. Once in a while, the organizers will impose something on us. Like, we had one organizer wanted to title our session, "Why Judges Are Biased." I'm like, that is not a good title. We tend to, so the judges come in the room, they don't even know we're going to collect data, typically. The organizers will, maybe the chief judge will, but, the 100 or so judges that are in the room start out not having any idea that we're going to collect data. So we pass out a survey to all of them, and we say, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to talk about judicial decision making, and we'd like to start by having you make a few decisions. In front of you are a series of hypothetical questions. We'd like you to take a moment and read through them and answer them as best you can. We recognize that some of them may seem unusual or different, but we've given these questions to many groups of judges before, and judges on the whole have found them sort of interesting and engaging and a good way to engage with our research. So we ask that you take a moment now, read through the questions. When you're done, close your survey, hold it up. One of us will collect it. And we'll have someone score the survey, and near the end of this presentation, we'll present your results back collectively. All the results are anonymous. Please do not put your name on the survey. We've never had that problem. And we'll give you aggregate results at the end. That's pretty much exactly the script I give to judges. So I'm always afraid at that moment. They're going to look up and go, "No, I'm not doing this." But they never do. Because it's fairly authoritatively stated. They have the survey in front of them. They open it up. There's nothing else to do. They could get on their smartphone, but they don't. They open it up. They look around if they're curious or puzzled by what they're doing. What they see is a whole group of other judges reading the questions. It's like, oh, that's what we're doing now. Judges are not different. They're not immune to group conformity. And really, the response rates we get in that setting are upwards of 90-95%. They virtually all fill it out. They all complete the survey. We give them the option at the end of having their survey scored for pedagogical purposes only at this presentation and never being used in research later. About 1 in 100 judges will tell us they want their data removed, and we remove them and throw them out. Other than that, and in many cases, judicial education attendance at these conferences is mandated. That's why I say they're not purely volunteers. So Minnesota, I said we had all of the trial judges. That's an annual conference they are obliged to attend. They have to be pretty much in the hospital to get out of attending that. They need special permission from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to not go to that conference. So they have to go. It's mandated. And we're one of the sessions, and so they're kind of stuck with us. They could refuse to fill out the survey. Our Human Research Board occasionally worries that we're being too coercive. I said, these are judges. What are you worried about? These people can defend themselves. And so we're very lucky in that regard. That methodology gets a very unbiased sample. Of course they worry about how they look, absolutely, which is to our advantage. They're trying to get these questions right. They're trying to get the right answer to the hypothetical. And the other interesting thing, they don't know there are 2 or 3 conditions. Right? They don't typically know what we're asking. Now, that's why the race stuff, the racial questions are kind of interesting, because when we're very explicit about identifying race, then they think they're on to us. And they kind of are, because then we say this is an African-American defendant. They go, aha, they're studying race. Somebody's got a white defendant. And they're right about that. And that's why I think they're on guard there. But when we're studying anchoring, they have no idea what we're studying. I'm sure they don't. We asked them later, did you know? Like, I don't know what you were doing. Or they even ask questions that suggest they didn't even understand what we were studying, even after we present it back. So it's a really good sample in that regard. And now, when I talk about talking to judges, I do worry about them self-presentation. That's why I'm so astonished on that gender problem. They're willing to tell us how biased they are, and that they're perfectly comfortable with that. That's unusual. And when we try to get research ideas from judges, that's typically one-on-one. That's a judge I know and I have some personal relationship with, who knows I won't identify them and won't try to make them look bad in some way. So I quite agree that's a potential problem. Now, your other question was on artificial intelligence. There's a strong trend in the United States right now to make decisions involving whether a defendant has to be kept in custody while awaiting trial or released on some form of bail, to use risk assessment tools, which are essentially artificially intelligence-generated strategies. Because what the judge is trying to do is not release a defendant who's likely to commit another crime. So they're making a risk assessment, a prediction as to how dangerous that defendant is or isn't. And there is an enormous amount of data on that. And so a number of researchers have tried to create these risk assessment tools for judges, which your observation is absolutely right, are better at that than judges are, because it incorporates the decisions and feedback of hundreds of thousands of cases. And so it has to be, by definition, better. We've actually been invited to study judges' reactions to that, because they use the risk assessment tools, but sometimes override them. Right? So they're getting the recommendation, and then, what are we supposed to do if I think this is wrong? I think my gut instinct on that is the judge is probably wrong, and we should just go with the risk assessment, knowing all about heuristics and biases. But you have to understand that that's a particular problem, too, with a well-defined outcome. Right? The judges are supposed to release a defendant if they believe they won't commit a crime while they're waiting trial, or will flee. Right? That's the other problem. And they're supposed to, keep a defendant in custody if they will flee or commit another crime. That's a really discrete, well-defined task, which is often not what a judge is supposed to be doing. A criminal sentencing decision incorporates many different factors, and it's a lot harder to say there's a clear goal to sentencing, because you're trying to affirm the injury caused to the victim. You're trying to deter future criminal. And so it's a much more difficult task, because it doesn't have a single dimension the way bail setting does. So that's an area that's, I think, very ripe for an artificial intelligence tool, which I think would be very beneficial for judges. But I'm confident in telling you judges are going to resist, because it feels wrong. It's very much their reaction is, this person shouldn't be confined, but the system is telling me that they should. And so what I guess I have to side with the artificial intelligence, because I'm telling judges use System 2, and that's much better data than they're ever going to get. And it's also apt to be unbiased in a sense. That's a little complicated, I know, but it's not going to be based on the judge's gut reaction to the litigant. So I like it better too. It's an uphill climb convincing judges to use it.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
Bueno, primero, muchas gracias. Me gustaría preguntar acerca de los efectos que puede tener el saber esto de los sesgos. Por ejemplo, en los jueces, o cuando usted hablaba del ambiente laboral, de tener diversidad, que no puede ocurrir también el efecto contrario, en el que yo ya sé que, por ejemplo, yo tengo la tendencia a reaccionar mal, a, no sé, decir que esa persona es culpable o lo que sea por su color de piel. Entonces, a la hora de yo saber eso, no puedo reaccionar al contrario, a decir, bueno, por el color de piel de esta persona, porque su piel es más oscura, entonces hay menos probabilidad de que yo condene a esa persona. Entonces, que ocurre el efecto contrario. Es eso.
Okay. Thank you. I take the question to be essentially how one responds. There is a concern with sort of an overreaction, with sort of a defensive racism that you do sometimes see in the literature, that when people have identified the fact that they harbor a particular bias, or they're worried that they do, that they then overreact. And so they're, in a sense, less likely to condemn that person than they would for somewhat of a different race. That's sort of challenging, and it's not a problem I've observed really in judges, because they don't really they aren't really prone to simply acquit people and not sentence them harshly. But it is a potential problem you see in human resources departments worry about this, and just an overreaction, a sort of defensive racism. It's not an easy problem to solve because, in fact, in part, the person is kind of doing the right thing, recognizing they have a bias and then trying to react to it. People really need to be a little more subtle in their reactions to bias. So I was telling Alexandra at dinner the other night that if you believe bias is a problem, you should practice what you preach and try to remedy it. I noticed that in class, that when I call on students, it was a few years ago, that I would defer calling on a number of the Asian American students, partly because some of them weren't Asian American, they were Asian. And their English skills weren't very good, and so a very interactive classroom discussion was hard. It was a lot more work. It's not that I can't do it, it just was a lot more work. And so I would end up putting off calling on the Asian students. I noticed this one day when I try to call on everybody in class in the first 3 or 4 weeks. The last day of the 4th week, like all I had left were the Asian students. So I'd put them off to the end. And I realized that I'm expressing a bias. I'm not picking the students at random. I'm trying not to call on a certain group. So what I did is I got a group of cards with their pictures and names on them, and I shuffled them, and I just call on them at random. That's rather than overreact and call on the Asian students first, I just incorporated a system of random distribution of how I called on students. And it's not perfect because I might move on students too quickly based on who they are. But really, remedies for cognitive error sort of have to be adaptive to how the error is actually working in practice. And one should be on guard for insufficient or over-sufficient reaction and try to be more subtle. I can't give us anything more than a global answer to that without a very specific example, but it's a good question.
¿Alguna última pregunta? Creo que ya estamos arriba del tiempo. Si nadie tiene una pregunta final, bueno, the last task.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, mi duda va encaminado un poquito más a las estrategias de medición de los sesgos cognitivos. O sea, yo estoy haciendo una investigación sobre la automedicación en México, pero al momento de ya yo querer saber cómo medir estos sesgos que pueden verse implícitos en mi investigación, como son la educación, el nivel socioeconómico, entre otros, sí he tenido como problemas en torno a la presentación o estructuración necesaria tanto de los cuestionarios. Por ejemplo, ahorita que en los casos que nos mencionó, pues fueron diferentes test que me llamaban mucho la atención, que quizás puedo encaminar de una u otra forma a mi investigación, pero en sí eso, o sea, todavía me genera un poco más de dudas. Y pues sí me gustaría así como, ¿cuál sería la estrategia o la forma de medición más como correcta, por así decirlo, hacia este tipo de sesgos?
You know, I keep the microphone because I have a follow. I don't quite know what your research is. So when you say it's on self-medication, I don't know exactly what you mean. So it's hard for me to answer the question without knowing.
Bueno, es sobre la automedicación en México. Lo estoy sosteniendo como una forma, bueno, una forma de cultura, o sea, es como cultura arraigada. Es ya, bueno, en México la automedicación es algo muy simple, porque si te sientes mal, tú puedes ir a adquirir el medicamento sin receta. Se empezaron a establecer como que estrategias legales en torno a que pues ya puedas adquirir tus medicamentos con la receta, pero no está todavía en todas las farmacias, no se encuentra como que no se sostiene como dicho legal, digámoslo así, y pues adquirir los medicamentos es en todos lados. Entonces, si al momento de yo tener el contacto con las personas o empezar a hacer como la medición de esto en mi muestra, de la medición de los datos en las muestras que quiero adquirir, sí me cuesta mucho trabajo en qué estrategia, o si puede ser, nos menciona que pueden ser cuestionarios, pueden ser diferentes como estrategias, pero no sé cómo acotarla, o sea, no sé cuál es como que la estructuración correcta para la elaboración de un cuestionario hacia los sesgos.
Tal vez, bueno, una pregunta ahí, o sea, ¿qué sesgo específicamente estás tratando de medir? Tal vez tendría que ver con clarificar un poco qué estás haciendo de investigación, qué es lo que estás midiendo exactamente.
Bueno, estoy midiendo como lo que vendría siendo el aspecto sociocultural, bueno, económico, y como estoy sosteniendo que es una forma de cultura ya, o sea, ya es como arraigado la automedicación, entonces no sé cómo, o sea, digámoslo así, cuando ya tengo el contacto con las personas para generar la muestra de mis datos y empezar a hacer la relación, bueno, yo estudio economía, entonces quiero hacer un modelo econométrico para establecer estos sesgos, esos tres, o sea, lo que vendría siendo la educación, la cultura y el nivel económico.
I can give a little bit of an answer to the. It's not quite my area, but there's a particular cognitive bias that arises from really two that arise from understanding of how medicine works. Most human illnesses are self-limiting, in the sense that they go away. So if you get a bad cold, if you do nothing, you will get better. Not immediately, not right away, but you tend to get better. The problem with that in terms of self-medication is that if you take something that does absolutely nothing, what you'll observe personally is that you get better. So then you'll decide, this worked. So you'll take it again, right? There's actually, I think, some evidence on a few different sort of self-medication regimes that's why that works. So people in the United States are obsessed with taking vitamin C for a cold. There's just no evidence it does anything. But you cannot deter people from that belief because they say, I took vitamin C, it worked, I got better. You say, well, you're not running a controlled experiment, of course. You're running on yourself. And that's the particular bias that can be produced by self-medication, that you know, if you take it and you feel a little better, well, it works. You're not using a science-based approach. And so what you could perhaps measure is to what extent individuals have more faith in their own beliefs than they do in doctors. Or others. The other thing that we see a little bit of in the United States now are beliefs about science and what science works and doesn't. In the United States, it's more about climate change than medicine, but we have a growing group that are of anti-vaccine people in the United States that are avoiding taking vaccines. We have a growing collection of measles outbreaks, a disease that we thought we'd never see in the United States again because large number of people won't get vaccinations. That is a similar cognitive error. Most people will observe the following. I didn't vaccinate my child. She didn't get sick. What's the problem? Right? Why do I need to do it? So it creates these sort of cognitive biases. There's also some cultural aspects to how people observe science. That science that's congenial to one's political beliefs is science people accept. So I live in a small town where there are a lot of anti-vaccine people, and it's because they don't trust large corporations. And that's who makes vaccines. So they're just bad. That's a real cultural a problem for them, and so they don't believe the science that vaccines work, and people will tend to believe things that are more congenial to what their worldviews are. There's some interesting stuff by a guy named Dan Kahan on that at Yale on cultural worldviews and beliefs about science that might be relevant to what you might want to do. It tends to translate well into different cultures too, so it would work well. I would look for him, Kahan at Yale. I would look at his stuff because he has pretty good measures of cultural worldviews and how it leads to accepting science or not accepting science, and then you might be able to correlate that with use of what scientists think are inappropriate medicines or medicines that are likely to work. So that it would start to operationalize things a little bit. But you know, it's a complicated project, so I can only give you a short answer.
Yo creo que tendrías un poquito que revisar exactamente, digamos, cómo está el diseño de la investigación, porque lo que tú estás tratando de entender como sesgos no son sesgos, tiene que ver con características de la población. Entonces, en realidad, un poco lo que te está comentando Jeffrey es que lo que tienes que, o sea, tu investigación tiene que ver con creencias y valores que están asociados con la medicación. ¿no? Entonces, y los sesgos tienen que ver con el comportamiento de las personas respecto a eso. Ya después son características de la población a investigar, ¿no? Y puedes hacer una diferencia de si personas que tienen un nivel socioeconómico menor están respondiendo de cierta manera u otra, pero tal vez especificar cuáles son estos valores y estas creencias, ¿no? En donde puede haber sesgos cognitivos. Pero creo que tendrías ahí un poquito que ajustar, ¿no? La investigación para que realmente llegues a ver si hay ciertos sesgos o no, ¿no? Es que estabas tú planteando que el nivel socioeconómico era un sesgo. Y ese no es un sesgo. Pero si quieres lo podemos platicar después, ¿sale? Okay. Entonces sí, porque ya es una cuestión de diseño de investigación, ¿no? Pues bueno, ya estamos llegando al término de estos 2 días y creo que todos nos llevamos una grata experiencia, Jeffrey. Te quiero agradecer muchísimo porque creo que, como lo habíamos comentado, son temas nuevos. Digo, hay ciertos grupos de investigación que están tratando de acercarse a esto y de entender los sesgos cognitivos desde diferentes perspectivas y en diferentes temas. Y creo que para nosotros como equipo de investigación y que creo que para todos los asistentes también ha sido muy enriquecedor conocer tu investigación, tu perspectiva. Nos has dado muchos elementos metodológicos a nivel de instrumentos, a nivel de información, que creo que nos va a ayudar mucho para seguir empujando estas investigaciones. Y pues bueno, te quiero agradecer muchísimo el trabajo puesto en estos 2 días y también dejar la puerta abierta, ¿no? Para que podamos seguir trabajando, para que podamos también pensar en investigaciones que puedan ser enriquecedoras tanto para tu trabajo como para el que estamos tratando de hacer desde el Programa de Derechos Humanos, pero también, digamos, desde otras iniciativas que estamos tratando de impulsar en cuestiones cognitivas. Así que muchísimas gracias. Vamos a darle un aplauso a nuestro ponente.
Muchas gracias.
¿Y quisieras decir algo más, ya nada más para cerrar y terminar?
Just would like to thank all of you for listening to me for the last 2 days. I thought your questions were excellent, and I learned a number of things from them. If you would like to interact with me further, as I said, I'm very, very easy to find. So please don't hesitate to email me or contact me. I'd look forward to interacting with some of you further. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Gracias a todos. Bueno, nada más 3 anuncios rápidamente. El primero es que creo que algunas personas llegaron tarde y no sé si se registraron. Sí les pediríamos que se registren porque, como saben, vamos a seguir teniendo otros eventos y si queremos tener la posibilidad de entrar en contacto con ustedes. También, si quisieran entrar en contacto con nosotros para aclarar cuestiones de investigación, temas que estén trabajando, esto, como lo comentamos, es un tema nuevo. Creo que hay diferentes experiencias que se están formulando con diferentes instituciones y bueno, nos interesa mucho acercarnos a ellas, conocerlas y realmente poder ir integrando un grupo de personas que estén interesadas en trabajar con los sesgos cognitivos. Nuestra siguiente sesión, como parte del ciclo de conferencias, es el 4 de junio, ya está abierto el registro. También va a ser la misma modalidad, vamos a tener una conferencia un poco más amplia y un taller un poquito más largo con Mariel Beasley, que viene de Duke University, y aquellos que estén interesados en seguir, por favor, regístrense en la plataforma, y si saben de personas que también puedan estar interesadas, por favor, ayúdenos también en cuestiones de la difusión. El último anuncio es que, bueno, próximamente vamos a dar la publicación del coloquio que estuvimos trabajando el año pasado. Yo no sé si algunos de ustedes estuvieron presentes en ese coloquio, pero bueno, también ahí hay una gran cantidad de temas que nos interesa mucho difundir y que esperamos que también se convierta en un referente para estos temas sobre los sesgos cognitivos. Entonces, pues les agradecemos mucho su interés y su presencia el día de hoy aquí y creo que sí. Las constancias, claro. Las personas que participaron en el taller del día de hoy, les podemos dar constancia, solamente que el programa sí tiene un pequeño costo para la constancia de 100 pesos. Entonces, aquellos que quieran una constancia de este taller, nada más les pediríamos que con Cincy, con Gil, por favor que pasen, avisarnos también y la constancia la tendrían que recoger en las oficinas del programa en Coyoacán. Ya, ¿verdad? ¿Tenemos algún otro anuncio que hacer? ¿No? Ok. Pues muchísimas gracias a todos, muchísimas gracias Jeffrey por haber estado aquí. Una gran presentación los 2 días, así que esperamos seguir trabajando contigo. Muchas gracias. Y gracias a las traductoras también. hope you take a different perspective of Mexico as
Oh,
well.
yes.